My parents lost their friends and blamed everyone but themselves. 10 years ago, my parents were at the center of elegant dinner parties, surrounded by longtime friends and lively conversations. Now, they are completely alone. One by one, they've severed ties over petty disagreements, drowning in bitterness and resentment. The breaking point: my father nearly got arrested at the airport over a smudged ticket. How did they end up like this? Is this just a natural part of aging, or is there something more to it? 10 years ago, my parents had a full social calendar. Their weekends were booked with dinner parties, wine tastings, and long conversations over elaborate meals. They belonged to a circle of accomplished, highly educated friends, professors, lawyers, doctors, people who shared their intellectual curiosity and competitive spirit. My mother would spend days planning the perfect menu, selecting just the right pairing of wines, ensuring the table was set with the finest china. My father, ever the sharp conversationalist, thrived in these gatherings, debating politics, philosophy, and literature with an air of superiority that, somehow, people tolerated, or maybe even admired. Back then, their friendship seemed unbreakable. These were people they had known for decades, some since their university days, others through professional circles or neighborhood connections. They vacationed together, supported each other through personal crises, and celebrated each other's milestones. There was a rhythm to their social lives, a sense of belonging that seemed permanent. But something changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the invitations stopped coming. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A scheduling conflict here, a missed call there. But then it became undeniable. They were no longer included. The group dinners continued, but my parents were left out. The realization hit hard, but instead of reflecting on why, they doubled down on their pride. I watched as, one by one, the friendships unraveled. It was never a dramatic falling out, at least not at first. It started with small grievances, the kind that most people overlook or talk through. But my parents, especially my mother, didn't let things slide. A friend forgot to return a borrowed dish, an unforgivable slight. Someone didn't praise my father's latest research paper with enough enthusiasm. Clearly, they were jealous. Someone dared to disagree with my mother's opinion on a political issue. A personal betrayal. And once a friend was deemed unworthy, there was no going back. My mother, with her razor-sharp memory for perceived wrongs, would cut them off without hesitation. My father, though more reluctant at first, followed suit, choosing pride over reconciliation. And so, one by one, their friendships withered away, casualties of their own stubbornness and unwillingness to forgive. Now, there are no more dinner parties. The fine china sits unused. The wine glasses gather dust. The phone stays silent, except for the occasional call from me. They still talk about their old friends, but only to criticize them, recounting their flaws and missteps as if rewriting history to justify their loneliness. I wonder if they ever feel the weight of it, the emptiness where friendships used to be, or if they truly believe they were always in the right, that everyone else was the problem. Do they miss the laughter, the camaraderie, the warmth of shared experiences? Or have they convinced themselves that they are better off alone? All I know is that the couple who once thrived in the company of others now spend their days talking only to each other, locked in a cycle of resentment and nostalgia. And I can't help but wonder, was this inevitable? Or could it have been different? As my parents' circle of friends grew smaller, their ability to maintain relationships seemed to deteriorate even further. It wasn't just that their friends had drifted away. It was that my parents actively pushed them out. What once had been minor annoyances turned into irreparable offenses. There was no room for second chances, no opportunity for apologies or explanations. A single mistake, a perceived slight, and that was it. The friendship was over, permanently. At first, it seemed like a string of unfortunate coincidences. My mother mentioned that an old friend of hers had stopped calling, but when I asked why, Her answer was unsettlingly simple. She showed up to dinner 15 minutes late, and she didn't even apologize. Another friend forgot to send a thank you note after receiving a gift. That was enough for my mother to decide she was done. If she can't even acknowledge a kind gesture, she clearly doesn't respect me, she said, as if her years of friendship with this woman had meant nothing. My father followed a similar pattern, though his reasons were often tied to wounded pride. His best friend of nearly 40 years, someone he had known since law school, was cast aside over what seemed like a trivial disagreement. They had argued over a political issue, something they had debated countless times before. But this time my father took it personally. "I can't believe he would say something so ignorant," he fumed. "If that's what he really thinks, I don't need someone like that in my life." And just like that, a lifetime of shared experiences, late-night conversations, and unwavering support was erased. What struck me most wasn't just how easily they cut people off. It was how little they seemed to regret it. If anything, they justified their actions with a sense of moral superiority. In their eyes, they weren't losing friends. They were purging their lives of people who didn't meet their impossible standards. But the reality was much sadder than they were willing to admit. They weren't just pushing people away, they were isolating themselves. And the worst part, they didn't seem to realize it. They convinced themselves that they didn't need anyone, that they were better off without the disrespectful and the ignorant. But I could see the cracks forming beneath their bravado. I remember asking my mother if she missed her closest friend, the woman she had known since college, the one she had recently cut out over a minor misunderstanding. Her response was sharp, dismissive. "I don't need people like that in my life." But there was something in her tone, something almost defensive, like she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince me. Deep down, I wondered if they ever felt the weight of their decisions. Did they ever pick up the phone, think about calling, and then stop themselves? Did they ever regret the friendships they had thrown away so carelessly? Or had they truly convinced themselves that they were better off alone? I wasn't sure. But what I did know was that the more people they pushed away, the lonelier they became. And I couldn't help but wonder, was there a moment, a single turning point, where they could have chosen a different path? Or was this simply who they had become? As my parents pushed more people away, their world grew smaller, not just physically, but emotionally. The warmth of friendships and shared experiences was replaced by a cold, ever-present bitterness. Instead of reminiscing fondly about old friends, they dissected their flaws. Instead of cherishing the years of laughter and companionship, they dwelled on every perceived slight, every supposed betrayal. Conversations with them became exhausting. No matter the topic, it would always spiral into complaints about the people they used to consider friends. My mother would bring up an old acquaintance, not to recall a happy memory, but to criticize her. "You remember Jane? She was always so selfish. I don't know how I put up with her for so long." My father, not one to be outdone, would shake his head and add, "And don't get me started on Tom. The man had no backbone. I should have dropped him years ago." It wasn't just former friends who became the targets of their disdain. It was everyone, neighbors, colleagues, even strangers they encountered in passing. A waiter who took too long to bring their food? Incompetent. A cashier who made small talk? Nosy. A distant relative who hadn't called in a while? Ungrateful. When their world was no longer a place filled with people they loved and trusted. It had become a battleground where everyone, it seemed, was against them. The saddest part was that they didn't see how this bitterness was consuming them. They had convinced themselves that they were simply telling the truth, that they were the only ones with the courage to see people for who they really were. But the truth was, they weren't seeing people at all, not as human beings with flaws and virtues, but as disappointments waiting to happen. I used to wonder if they were lonely, if they ever missed the company of others. But whenever I brought it up, they were quick to dismiss the idea. "We don't need people like that," my mother would say, her voice tinged with both anger and sadness. My father would nod in agreement, adding, "We're better off without them." And yet, for all their certainty, they didn't seem happy. There was an edge to their voices, a weariness in their eyes. They had built walls so high that even if someone wanted to come back into their lives, they wouldn't know how to let them in. And the worst part, I don't think they even realized it. I often wonder, when they sit together in the quiet of their home, do they ever think about the life they used to have? The dinner parties, the long conversations, the friendships that once meant everything? Or have they rewritten history so completely that they truly believe they are better off alone? All I know is that the bitterness that once seemed directed at others has started to consume them from within. And I can't help but wonder, what happens when there is no one left to blame? As the bitterness settled in, something else began to change in my parents. Something more volatile, more unpredictable. Their frustration, once confined to private complaints and whispered criticisms, started spilling into the world around them. They no longer just talked about their grievances behind closed doors. They acted on them, and often in ways that left me both shocked and deeply unsettled. It started subtly. My mother, always proud of her poise and social etiquette, began snapping at waiters in restaurants over the smallest inconveniences. "This isn't what I ordered," she would say sharply, even when the dish in front of her was exactly what she had asked for. My father, who once enjoyed lively debates, now took disagreements as personal attacks. If someone contradicted him, even over something trivial, he would raise his voice, his hands shaking with frustration. Then came the real outbursts. I'll never forget the moment I realized just how far things had escalated. My father and I were at the airport, standing in line at the check-in counter. His boarding pass had been printed with smudged ink, and when the desk agent calmly suggested he reprint it at the kiosk, something in him snapped. His voice, deep and commanding, turned into a shout, echoing across the terminal. "I paid for this ticket. It's not my job to fix your mistakes." The young woman behind the counter looked startled, but remained professional. "Sir, I understand, but all you need to do is—" "Unbelievable! This is incompetence at the highest level." My father slammed his palm against the counter, his face red with fury. People around us turned to watch, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Before I could intervene, 3 airport security guards appeared, their expressions firm but controlled. They flanked my father, their presence a silent warning. I could see it, the moment he realized just how close he was to being handcuffed, arrested, maybe even charged with assault. For a brief second, there was hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Embarrassment? But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He let out a huff, grabbed the ticket from the counter, and stormed off, muttering under his breath. I wanted to tell him how close he had come to real consequences, to something far worse than an argument, but I knew he wouldn't listen. To him, this wasn't his fault. It was the world's fault, full of incompetent people who didn't meet his standards. It was the same with my mother. I watched as she lost patience with everyone around her, as small inconveniences turned into battles she felt she needed to win. A grocery store clerk who rang up an item incorrectly became an enemy. A neighbor who parked too close to her driveway became a personal affront. Their anger, once subtle and restrained, had become something untamed, something public. And the most terrifying part? They didn't seem to recognize it. Or worse, they believed they were justified. After years of severed friendships, simmering resentment, and public outbursts, my parents now live in a world of their own making, one that is quiet, yet filled with unspoken bitterness. They have pushed everyone away, and yet they refuse to acknowledge the loneliness that lingers in the empty spaces of their lives. Their home, once filled with laughter, conversation, and the occasional clinking of wine glasses, now feels eerily still. The dining table, once the heart of lively dinner parties, is now just a place where two people eat in silence. There are no more invitations, no more spontaneous visits from friends. The phone barely rings, except for the occasional call from me. And yet, when I ask them about it, they pretend as if nothing has changed. We don't need those kinds of people in our lives, my mother insists, as if she's reassuring herself more than me. My father nods, echoing the sentiment. People are disappointing. It's better this way. But I see the truth in the small moments they don't talk about. The way my mother lingers just a second too long at the mailbox, as if hoping for an invitation that will never come. The way my father still checks his phone out of habit, only to put it down with a quiet sigh when he realizes there's no message waiting for him. The way they sit across from each other, running out of new things to say, stuck in an endless cycle of complaining about people who no longer care enough to be in their lives. They've rewritten the past so many times that I wonder if they even remember what it felt like to have friends. The people they once shared vacations with, celebrated birthdays with, leaned on during difficult times. Now they only speak of them with contempt. She was never really a good friend, my mother will say about someone she once considered her closest confidant. He was always selfish, my father mutters about his former best friend. It's easier to believe that everyone else was the problem than to admit that maybe, just maybe, it was their own actions that led them here. I wonder if they realize what they've lost. Not just friendships, but the joy that comes with human connection. The comfort of reminiscing about old times with people who were actually there. The warmth of being included, of being thought of knowing someone is excited to see you. Instead, they have each other. Only each other. But even that, I can tell, isn't enough. Their conversations, once filled with sharp wit and intellectual debates, have dulled into repetitive complaints and bitter rehashings of past grievances. They aren't growing together. They're just reinforcing each other's resentment, feeding off the negativity until it's all they have left. I try to imagine what the future holds for them. What happens when their world gets even smaller? When health starts to fail, when they need help but have no one to turn to, when even anger is no longer enough to distract them from the loneliness they refuse to acknowledge. I don't know if they'll ever realize what they've done. Maybe one day when it's too late they'll reach for the phone and realize there's no one left to call. Or maybe they never will. Maybe they'll go on believing that they were the ones who chose this life, rather than admitting that, in the end, the choice was never really theirs to make. My parents' story is not just about aging, it's about choices. The choice to push people away rather than forgive. The choice to hold onto resentment rather than seek understanding. The choice to believe they are better off alone rather than admit they might be lonely. I wonder if they ever reflect on the life they used to have. If they ever feel the weight of the silence around them. Maybe they do, but pride keeps them from admitting it. Or maybe, after years of convincing themselves that others weren't worth their time, they've come to believe it as truth. And yet, I can't help but wonder, was this inevitable? Does aging always bring isolation, or did they create it themselves? Could things have turned out differently if they had chosen patience over pride, kindness over criticism? Perhaps the more important question is, could this happen to any of us? Do we all risk becoming versions of them, shutting people out until one day we look around and realize we have no one left? Or is there still time to choose a different path?